To be sure, Kasparov was a virtuoso in every type of position, but above all else, he excelled in the art of attack. And in this video, we'll be looking at some of his best onslaughts. Let's start with a fairly one-sided game that nonetheless makes quite an impression. Kasparov had the white pieces against Marianovic during the Malta Olympiad in November of 1980. Looking at this position, white's pieces seem quite active and are starting to creep toward the black king. Right now, white has the threat of knight h6 check, revealing the bishop on h3, and picking up the queen. All it takes is one seemingly innocuous misstep from black for things to fall apart. King h8 makes sense. White no longer has any knight checks, and the queen should be safe. White's light square bishop looks a little silly now. Yet 17 knight e4 exclam. This move might not look too terrifying, but it's actually decisive. Notice that taking the knight is impossible due to the pawn being pinned against the queen. Yet the white knight is eyeing the dark square bishop, which happens to be the only real defender of the king side. Without that bishop on the board, white should be able to smash through black's delicate pawn structure. To be sure, some calculation would be required, but intuitively, it looks incredibly strong. There's a couple of tries here. d4 could at least have muddied the waters. Knight takes f6, g takes f6, bishop d6, rook g8, queen takes d4, rook g6, rook on a to c1, knight e6, and queen d1. White is winning here, but black can still have some hope. Black could have also tried 17 rook a to e8, followed by knight takes g7 from white. Queen takes h3, knight takes e8, d takes e4, knight takes f6, e3, f3, blunting the bishop, knight e6, and bishop e5 wins on the spot with threats against the black king. In the game, bishop takes b2. I guess you get a pawn, but you're also about to let Garry Kasparov all over your king side. Knight g5. Very nice. As Kasparov phrases it, the concentration of white's pieces on the king side clearly supersedes the king's defensive abilities. Kasparov took only 3 minutes on this move, which shows that thoughts of keeping material with 18 rook b1 didn't even cross his mind. If 18 bishop takes a1, queen h5, h6, knight takes h6, g6, knight takes f7 check, king g7, queen h7 check, f6, knight e4 check, d takes e4, bishop g5, mate. Black played queen c6, attempting to stop the clobbering of queen h5 with queen g6. But now it's the other knight's turn to wreak havoc. Knight e7. No need to be too clever here, attacking the queen, covering the g6 square, and cutting off the only free square for the black king. Queen f6, and here comes the knockout, knight takes h7. The king's flimsy defenses are blown. Of course, taking the knight is taboo due to queen h5 check, winning the black queen. Queen d4. Maybe Kasparov will trade queens? Not during an attack like this. Queen h5. If I were the black king, I'd be sweating at this point. g6 gives the king a little room, and while queen h6, taking away that room is tempting, then black has queen g7, and suddenly things are complicated. So instead, queen h4. Bishop takes a1. Kasparov writes, "Instead of resigning, Marianovic suddenly captured my queen's rook, the only piece that disrupted the overall picture. I sighed with relief. That troublesome rook really got on my nerves." Indeed, it is rather comical that Marianovic has chosen to gorge on material at this treacherous time, but his king was obviously beyond salvation. Knight f6 check, not the only way to win, but the most efficient. White will give checkmate after king g7, queen h6 check, king takes f6, bishop g5 mate. 3 years later, at an international tournament in the town of Nikšić, Kasparov faced Hungarian grandmaster Lajos Portisch, one of the most solid players of all time. However, that reputation did not help Portisch neutralize Kasparov's aggressive play. Watch how Kasparov changes the structure of his pawns to unleash his pieces. Things get rolling with our game with Kasparov's 15th move, c4, where we can already get a hint of releasing the dark squared bishop towards the king. C takes d4, not the best move. Portisch tries to target white's c4 pawn, seriously underestimating the weaknesses of his king and the power of white's bishops. E takes d4 and knight a5, hitting white's c-pawn. Portisch was banking on this move, hoping for white to defend the pawn with the rook on c1 or knight d2. But if you understood Kasparov's goal of freeing his pieces for an attack, the next move shouldn't be too hard to find. d5. As usual, Kasparov played this move without hesitation, taking only 3 minutes on his clock to think about it. White sacrifices his center, but all of his pieces, especially the bishops, come alive in devastating fashion, leaving Black dreadfully unprepared to shield his vulnerable king. Black is far from lost, but once Kasparov began an objectively sound attack, he was essentially unstoppable. Knight takes c4 afforded Black the best chances of a successful resistance, especially in light of the fact that White is now forced to find several accurate moves in order to maintain the initiative. In the game, E takes d5. This is way too cooperative. C takes d5, bishop takes d5, and bishop takes h7 check. It's tough to part with such a monstrous bishop, but now Black's king is weakened even further, and White's rooks enter the fray with tremendous effect. King takes h7, rook takes d5, and king g8. Portisch had been aiming for this position. For the moment, Black's king is tucked away, and it's hard to see a convincing way to fuel the attack. All calculation aside, it's clear that the g7 pawn is the king's only remaining defender. Without it, White's ultra-active rook and fearsome tandem of queen and knight will wreak immediate havoc on the naked monarch. But giving up the dark square bishop, the pride of White's position, for a measly pawn? Yes, indeed. Bishop takes g7. With 3 of White's pieces itching to tear the king to shreds, White can well afford to sacrifice a 4th in order to let them fulfill their desires. Yes, the dark square bishop was very strong, but the queen, knight, and rook constitute more than enough firepower to get the job done against a woefully unprotected king. Kasparov spent 27 minutes on this move, so obviously he did not make it simply out of general considerations. But it is clear that this sacrifice is based on lucid, objective, sound tactical principles. It's no surprise that the concrete details work out in White's favor as well. As a matter of fact, Kasparov, the ultimate man of objectivity, duly notes that this spectacular sacrifice was not the only way to strengthen the attack. King takes g7 and knight e5, the excellent follow-up. Portisch scrambles to activate his remaining pieces to distract White from the king's side and dilute the strength of the attack. But it's too late. Rook on f to d8, the most resilient move, queen g4 check, king f8, queen f5. Before penetrating to d7 with the knight, Kasparov tightens the noose and induces a further weakening. If Black tries bishop d6, queen f6, bishop takes e5, rook takes e5, king g8, rook h5 brings it home for White. So in the game, Black plays the necessity f6, and White responded with the simple yet powerful knight d7 check. Black gives up the rook for the knight, but even without the horse, White's attack will be incredibly strong. With that, the first stage of the attack is complete. White is no longer down material, but with only a rook and queen participating, it'll be harder to throw more oil onto the fire. To round off a brilliantly played game, White will need to demonstrate accuracy and calculation precision. Queen c5, offering the queen trade, but of course Kasparov says no with queen h7, continuing to encircle the king. Rook c7, an important moment. Trading the rooks is obviously in Black's favor, so at one point or another, White will have to retreat their rook. But doing so immediately would fall prey to an unexpected and spectacular tactical blow. Queen takes f2, and the tables suddenly turn in black's favor since white has nothing better than king takes f2, then bishop c5 check, king g3, rook takes h7, takes f6 check, king e7, and it's a whole new game. So in the actual game, instead of rook d3, first we have queen h8 check, king f7, and only now rook back to d3, since white's queen isn't being eyed by the rook on c7. Knight c4, Portisch finally rouses the sleeping knight, but he's a day late and $1 short. Nonetheless, black has nothing better. Rook on f to d1. Unbelievable precision yet again. Kasparov shows that he is in no hurry and improves his pieces to the fullest extent before embarking on the final king hunt. With all of white's remaining pieces participating in the attack, black is completely busted. Knight e5, Portisch desperately tries to plug the holes, but now his king is driven out of his shell and fed to the wolves. Queen h7 check. If king f8, rook d8 check, bishop takes rook, and rook takes bishop delivers checkmate. If king e8, queen g8 check, bishop f8 blocks, queen e6 check, bishop blocks again, but rook d8 is mate since the bishop is pinned. Thus in the game, the king is forced to e6. Queen g8 check, knight f7 and rook e1 check doesn't offer much relief, so king f5, g4, the final blow. King f4, rook d4 check, king f3, queen b3 check. Understandably enough, Portisch decided to call it a day. After queen c3, queen d5 check, king e2, queen e4 check, it's all over with a breathtaking display. While patience is crucial, an attack will fizzle out unless decisive action is taken at critical moments. If your opponent is on the verge of consolidation, you must open a second theater of attack. As usual, Garry makes it look easy. Let's look back at the FIDE World Cup in 1989 held in Barcelona. Kasparov held the white pieces against Valery Salov. Black has been rather slow to develop his king side and get his king to safety, which isn't the best idea when facing our great attacker. Things heat up as soon as move 12 with knight d5. When Kasparov sacrifices a piece like this, it's rarely a good sign for his opponent. While taking the knight does not lose by force, white will develop a crushing attack within 4 or 5 moves. Here, Salov tries to maintain the status quo, but it's already too late. In the game, queen b8 followed by white's rook d1, a typical Kasparov follow-up. Instead of burning all bridges and trying to cash in immediately, he simply turns up the heat and tosses the ball back into black's court. Taking the knight is still futile in this situation, so g6. Understandably enough, Salov tries to develop his bishop and tuck away his king even if it means weakening his position further. Bishop g5, bishop g7, and it might appear that black is on the cusp of holding his own. But Kasparov finds a pretty way to nab a pawn. Bishop takes f6. Realizing he can't break through by brute force, Kasparov prudently converts his dynamic advantage into a material one. If the bishop recaptures, knight takes bishop, knight takes knight, e5, bishop takes g2, pawn takes knight, bishop h3, queen e4, castles, queen h4, and black will have to give up the bishop to prevent queen h6, leading to mate. So in the game, knight takes f6, allowing knight takes b6, rook d8, and e5. This move will let the white queen loose on black's king. Bishop takes g2, e takes f6, threatening both of black's bishops, bishop takes f6, and this is the position Salov had been aiming for, expecting 19 king takes g2 or 19 knight d5. But with the monarch's defenses wearing so thin, and with white's queen, rook, and 2 knights occupying impeccable attacking positions, how can there not be a way to break through? What do you think Kasparov played here? Knight takes e6. When Kasparov is attacking, it always seems like he has a limitless supply of pieces to sacrifice. He gives up one knight, and the next one simply appears on the right square. Black's final line of defense is shattered, and the ensuing attack is more diabolical than ever. F takes e6, queen takes e6 check, bishop e7. Now, black is technically up a piece at the moment, but material can't be further from Kasparov's mind right now. c5. Black cannot afford to open the d-file, so he has no choice but to allow the c-pawn to advance even further, tearing his position apart limb from limb. Bishop b7, saving the bishop, and only now rook e1, when black must also worry about the c-pawn, does Kasparov switch to the e-file. Queen c7, followed up by c6, and now back to the c-file again. Bishop takes c6, rook on a to c1, pinning the bishop. Black can't take the knight or allow rook takes c6, deflecting the queen, otherwise checkmate would be sure to follow. Black has no choice but to jettison loads of material. Rook d7, knight takes d7, queen takes d7, queen c4. Kasparov does not relax for a second. The attack has ended successfully, but the game isn't over yet. A few moves with precise technique and calculation are still required. Bishop b7, queen c7 is crushing. If queen takes c7, then rook takes c7, and black loses one or both of his bishops. Rook f8, queen b8 check, king f7, rook c7, the final blow. Black loses even more material, so a devastated Salov raised the white flag. If you loved these games as much as I did, make sure to check out the positions for yourself on Chess.com. And if you thought these moves were good, you should click right here to see the top 10 best moves of all time. We'll see you in that one.